do I do here? Oh, get rid of that. Just while I'm doing this, a couple of caveats. I should have actually titled this Danger on the Tracks, the Perils of Train Travel, thank you, in 19th century Britain. So this is very much focused on 19th century British travel, which was very, very different to the impact of the railway system in America, France and Germany. So it's focused very much on Britain. The second caveat, this is probably more important, is I'm not a train spotter. Under no circumstances should I be mistaken for a train spotter. I am not. Sometimes I am at risk of becoming one, and I think that were I alive in the steam age of the 19th century, I probably would have become a very good train spotter, but not in the 21st century. So we've cleared that up. Just finally too, a lot of these images I'm not going to speak to directly until towards the end of this talk, because they self-evidently illustrate or illuminate some of the things that I'm going to be addressing. So, given the title of my talk, it would be reasonable to expect that I will be addressing 19th century railway accidents. After all, in the 19th century, particularly in the 1840s and the 1850s, when railway technology was still very much at its early stage, there were some spectacular, well-publicised railway accidents. In the first 6 months of 1852, for example, 113 people were killed in railway accidents and 264 were injured. In the first 6 months of the following year, the statistics are even worse, with 148 deaths and 302 injuries. Now, it's almost impossible to calculate how many people were actually travelling by train at this time. But I think in the 1850s, early 1850s, I think there were about 600, maybe 700,000 people a year taking the train in Britain. Now, how do I get this forward? Right, okay. While some of these deaths and injuries were the result of train collisions and derailments, as one would expect, most were the result of people attempting to get off or on the train while it was moving. Many died in fires that regularly broke out in the wooden carriages. All trains were made out of wood at this stage. So death by fire was a major cause of death on this system. And this was not assisted by the fact that first-class passengers were irregularly locked in to their wooden carriages. And these wooden carriages were gas-lit. And so when there was a little bit of a bump, the carriages would go up in flames. And that's why first-class passengers were never allowed to smoke. It was for no concern of health, except for the fact that you were going to die by fire if you smoked and fell asleep. So others were killed because some railway lines provided seating on the roofs of the carriages. And these passengers, often in a state of panic, that was induced by the prospect of entering a long, dark tunnel. This was going to be very important for Freud much later when he wrote about the tunnel. These people would attempt to jump off the moving train, only to be struck by an arch of the overhead bridge. Indeed, even as late as 1862, the Railway Travellers' Handbook urged travellers to jump off a moving train when they felt threatened. And of course there were those who suffered horrific injuries, if not death, because when travelling in open-sided carriages, which is the image you can see on the top right, this is a third-class carriage. This was the design of third-class carriages right up into about the 1960s, 1860s rather, depending on which line you were travelling on. So these people who were travelling in open-sided carriages would stick their heads, legs and arms out, and their protruding limbs were struck by passing trains, by the iron columns that supported bridgework, or by railway signals. This was a very, very common way of being killed on the train. But the railway system brought other dangers too. Railway travel afforded new opportunities for criminal behaviour. Card sharps, pickpockets and thimble riggers
frequented the trains, as did luggage thieves and robbers, who were particularly fond of disguising themselves as Church of England clergymen. It's a great trick. Thus, not one that I would advocate though, thus the Railway Traveller's Handbook of 1862 advised, and here I quote, "In going through a tunnel, it is always as well to have the hands and arms disposed for defence, so that in the event of an attack, the assailant may be immediately beaten back or restrained." You can see how why Freud had such fun with the tunnel. Female criminals were more inclined to blackmail, which usually followed a licentious encounter. And if their demands were not met, they did not hesitate to approach the porter at the end of the journey with accusations of improper advances. In an 1865 House of Commons report, it was noted, and here I quote, "Gentlemen passengers, as well as railway officers of all classes, constantly refuse to travel singly with a stranger of the weaker sex, under the belief that it is only common prudence to avoid in this manner all risk of being accused for purposes of extortion, of insult or assault." In addition to these dangers, and we'll get to the moral ones shortly, in addition to these dangers were the effects of the ever-expanding railway networks upon the countryside. William Wordsworth, Anthony Trollope, Matthew Arnold, Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, all lamented the loss of some primal innocence that would result from the incursion of the railways into areas such as Wordsworth's beloved Lake District. But it was George Meredith, I think, who really got to the heart of the matter in his 1885 novel, Diana of the Crossways. Meredith's heroine, Diana Warwick, objects to the way the railways cut through the landscape. "Those railways," she says, "I have borne many changes with equanimity. I pretend to a certain degree of philosophy, but this mania for cutting up the land does really cause me to pity those who are to follow us. They will not see the England we have seen. It will be patched and scored and disfigured, a sort of barbarous Maori visage, England in a New Zealand mask." And she continues, "I love my country. I do love quiet rural England. I love its beauty. I love its simplicity. All that will be destroyed by the refuse of the towns flooding the land." Here we have it. All those members, and now I'm going to 19th century rhetoric, okay? Don't accuse me of believing this. This is 19th century language I'm now turning to. All those members, the refuse, all those members of the lower orders, the refuse, the great unwashed, the unruly mob, and the atavistic hordes who, released from the miasmic jungles of darkest England and freed from their urban rookeries, will contaminate, to use Wordsworth's word, quiet rural England, and no doubt flatten Wordsworth's bucolic daffodils. Under these circumstances, with the social order under threat of collapse, it is no surprise that the best day to undertake railway construction in terms of productivity was a Sunday. On that day, the country folk were in church, and the navvies and the railway workers could work in peace to build the Dantean underworld of smoke and fire that Ruskin and Carlyle envisaged. Indeed, some railway lines were built by night. The London to Birmingham railway line, made famous, of course, by Charles Dickens in Dombey and Sons, that a huge portion of that railway line was built at night because by day they were under siege from the local villages. Then, of course, there were the huge financial losses that investors faced. Sorry, I've got one too far. No, I haven't. Then there were the huge financial losses that investors faced, including, of course, Charles Dickens and the likes of Emily Bronte. These investors lost an enormous amount of money during the railway manias that punctuated the economic framework of 19th century Britain. There were the endless debates in Parliament that addressed the likelihood of railways decimating Britain's agricultural industry because it was feared the smoke and dust spewed forth by the steam engines would permanently blacken the fleeces of white sheep. And finally, from about the 1860s, this is is the image that you're looking at on the right. It's an image from 1835, and it's an image that I cannot find anything out about except that this family are setting off on a journey in 1835. It's a very early stage of railway travel, and the mother, we take this to be the mother, is applying some kind of patch that is going to prevent the child from getting some kind of disease by railway travel. And I don't know what is used in these patches. I suspect it might have been pimento and spices, I'm not quite sure. But illness was a real issue from about the 1860s, when medical journals such as the Lancet and the British Medical Journal began to speak of the havoc that railway travel could induce on the human body. The eyes, for example, were regarded as particularly susceptible to damage, and thus passengers were urged not to read while travelling on a train, and they were advised to travel with their eyes closed. There are all sorts of extraordinary railway diseases that are written about at length, particularly in the Lancet, from the 1860s on. And it was the 19th century train travel that gave rise to the diagnosis of the so-called railway spine, or, as the psychologist Wrigler termed it in 1879, compensation neurosis. Right? Note here how economics is attaching to the story of human health in a context of new institutions such as liability laws and the accident insurance policies, which also emerged in response to railway networks. In the opening decades of the 20th century, railway spine would come to be known as shell shock, and by the end of that century, it was recast as post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's most likely that this is what Charles Dickens had when he suffered very, very badly indeed in this terrible, terrible train accident of 1865. And he heroically, this is his carriage here, I hope you can hear me, this is his carriage here. This is in fact not a locomotive, this is a second class engine here. And Dickens was in this carriage. He was, of course, returning from Paris with his lover and his lover's wife, having his lover's mother, I think. I was thinking about his wife, his poor wife. So let me rephrase. Dickens was returning from Paris with his lover and his lover's mother. Dickens having left his wife, I think, in 1863. And I think about 10, maybe 20 people were killed. There were terrible, terrible injuries as well in this crash. But Dickens was such a hero that, having got his lover and his lover's mother out of the carriage, he then went back in to get the manuscript of Our Mutual Friend, which was just about complete. And of course, a few days later, he wrote in a letter some very, very detailed descriptions of the symptoms that he was beginning to display. And it now appears fairly certain that, in fact, he had post-traumatic stress disorder, railway spine, or what Wrigler would have termed compensation neurosis. Right. So, Britain's moral codes did not escape the effects of the growing railway network. And for many, railways were synonymous with the threat of moral collapse. As spatial arenas that brought people together, railway stations and trains were sites of potential disorder, where the proximity of huge numbers of people might undermine the moral order of the day. Conflating morality with class, railway companies adopted a number of measures to minimise contact between first, second and third class passengers, including, of course, the one that we're most familiar with today, class-based carriages. But they also provided separate railway stations for first class passengers. And some railway companies required third class passengers and fourth class passengers to travel on completely different trains. But these systems could not guarantee that class-based boundaries would not be breached, nor that moral codes would remain intact, because the railway network was essentially a meeting place. It's the 19th century forerunner of the World Wide Web. It is. The railway network was essentially a meeting place of strangers. And as such, it constituted a site of suspicion, confusion, and masquerade. Right? And it's masquerade that is occurring here in the right-hand image. I hope you can read the text. These charming ladies who are taking off on some kind of holiday, possibly taking off to France, believe that they have been accosted by these thieves. And they believe that these men are thieves precisely because they're wearing beards. Yeah. But in fact they're not, they're railway porters. Right? So there's these confusions, a lot of confusion occurs in train stations and on the trains themselves about the identity of people. So it's in that sense that railway networks are sites of suspicion, confusion and masquerade. And let's not forget people dressing up as Church of Englishmen clergy. Yeah? So, railway stations were places where moral rectitude might be compromised, or, to use Wordsworth's language, contaminated. In Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, for example, the incipient romance of Margaret Hale and John Thornton becomes threatened when Margaret is reported to have met an unknown man at the Milton railway station. The House of Commons received numerous complaints about vulgar behaviour and having to associate with workers who bore the odours of dirt and hard manual labour. And here is an extract from one such complaint lodged with the House of Commons in about 1864, and I quote, "The workmen used foul language and spat on the floors, smoked offensive pipes, cooked herrings in the waiting room, if they were left open, would you believe it? Cut off leather window straps and stole them, and if they arrived too early for work, hung about the station killing time, with evil consequences for the young female workers." Under such conditions, vigilance and caution was essential. And to see how this played out, I'd now like to turn to my final image, and it's a painting by Abraham Solomon of 1854, and its title is there, First Class, The Meeting. Here we have, this is not a very good reproduction. It's very, very difficult to get good colour reproductions of this particular image. And yes, it is a ghastly painting. It's a dreadful, dreadful painting. I wouldn't take it if someone offered it to me. But it is quite ghastly. But it is extraordinarily interesting, and it tells us a tale about British morality in relation to railway networks. Here we have a romantic scene, yeah? It's the idea of love at first sight, that very popular Victorian trope. A young man, as you can see, gazes at a young woman who is travelling with her father, who is sleeping, oblivious to the flirtatious behaviour. With her rosy cheeks, her downcast eyes, her well-groomed hair and tightly fitting bonnet, she is the picture of virtuous mid-Victorian femininity. She's exactly how Victorian women were supposed to look and were supposed to behave. And yet, when the painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1854, it quickly became the subject of hostile criticism. Here, for example, is the critic of the Art Journal in June 1854. He writes, "As a picture, it is executed with great knowledge and power, but it is to be regretted that so much facility should be lavished on so bald and vulgar a subject." The critic for The Spectator claimed the painting to be less than pleasing and took umbrage at the young man who was described, this is the young man at the right, obviously, took umbrage at the young man who was described as, I can't wait to call my son this, he was described as an arrant spoony. Now, an arrant spoony is a foolishly amorous person, normally a title attached to young men, like my son. Solomon, I can't wait to tell him he's an arrant spoony. Anyway, Solomon clearly took these criticisms to heart, because in the following year, he painted a second version of this painting in which he eliminated all traces of vulgarity. I hate to say it, but the
painting is no better than the first, right? But let's have a look at it just to close up in some detail, right? So here's the first painting that we've done. Here's our Aaron Spoonie. Here's our virtuous mid-Victorian, young woman. And here's the father fast asleep, right? He's nodded off to sleep because the train's in motion. This tassel here that indicates the train is in motion. It's sunset, yeah, dangerous time of the day, ladies and gentlemen. The dark is just around the corner. And with Dad asleep, what's going to happen? Well, we know what's going to happen because in the corner over here, I hope you can see it, in the corner here we've got this fishing rod, right, which our Aaron Spoonie he's off fishing. But clearly at this moment he's thinking about fishing for something other than fish. Yeah? Then down here we've got this bouquet of very seductive open blossoms, right? For some of you, you might recall your mother or your grandmother or your great-grandmother saying, "Oh my, aren't you blooming, my dear?" Right? So these blooming flowers indicate her sexuality and indeed that she has come of age and her sexual availability. And then we've got this man here who's just unconscious with the motion of the train. Right? Then we come to this image here where all traces of immorality have been eliminated. Going from left to right, it's not sunset anymore. No hanky-panky with the darkness that's just about to arrive. Yeah? It's bright blue. Right? Everything can be seen. Right? It's the middle of the day. This young girl has been pushed back into the corner of the painting, into the corner of the carriage room, where rather ironically she is looking very directly at our Aaron Spoonie, whereas before she was behaving appropriately and her eyes were downcast. Then our man has come to life. Dad's come to life, he's bounced up, he is now separating, he's physically separating these two characters so that there's no risk of any physical contact between them. And he is engaging with this Aaron Spoonie, right? And likewise the Aaron Spoonie is engaging with him. The Aaron Spoonie has transformed, yeah? He's transformed from Aaron Spoonie into a lieutenant in the Navy. And the fishing rod has gone. Fishing is no longer the interest, but this sword, this rather phallic sword, downwards pointing nevertheless, but this sword that you can see here indicates patriotic, his sense of duty, that indicates patriotism rather than the flimsy pastimes of an Aaron Spoonie. Okay? So all of this, eliminates the signs of immorality. I'm just about finished, but as an aside, if this was a French painting of the mid-19th century, we would suspect that he, in fact, is her lover. But no self-respecting French artist of the mid-19th century would ever paint such a scene. Right? So that kind of persuades us that this is not her lover, and he's not wealthy enough to have this young woman as his lover. Right? So what has happened here in this painting? Well, to wrap up, a narrative that conforms more closely to Victorian etiquette and gender ideals has replaced the corruption of morals that is displayed in the first version. As moral narratives, these two paintings highlight the dangers of railway travel, and they reveal the vigilance and the conduct that was required to protect Britain's moral code. And in this case, it's conveyed through the paternal authority of the father. For in the midst of railway mayhem, class could no longer function as a guarantor of civility, nor of certain moral standards. Thank you.